Hello, everybody. I hope you're enjoying KetoCon, and this is a new format. And I think that you should join on the live Q&A session after you see this presentation. I want to start out by introducing my bike. This is my gravel bike. I've been coming to work for the last 3 months during this lockdown, rain or shine on that bike. I've posted a YouTube video. Hopefully you will go to my bike ride and leave a positive comment on that. So today I'm going to take a deep dive on ketones. I have been practicing low carb and preaching low carb to my patients for the last 7 years. And I have heard various terms being thrown out at conferences about ketogenic diet and about ketones. But I don't think that a low carb practitioner understands ketones that well. I didn't. And here is my attempt to let you know what ketones are. The story of ketones should start with the story of the brain. The brain is an energy hog. It's 2% of our body, but it consumes 20% of its energy. It's uncompromising in its demand for energy. It demands about 6 grams of sugar. Most people are on a standard American diet. 6 grams of sugar every hour, about 110 to 140 grams over 24 hours. It wants that sugar whether it is fed or fasted, whether you are sick or healthy. It cannot use fatty acids and proteins as energy source. Fatty acids do not even cross the blood-brain barrier. It makes its own cholesterol and fatty acids as well as proteins. It does not depend on the rest of the body to make it. The brain is unwilling to share in energy deficit when you're fasting. This is an important point to be made. The rest of the body compromises. Thank God the brain does not compromise, because you don't want your brain to atrophy. But the rest of the body reduces its basal metabolism. There is reduction in energy use by the gut. You reduce your exercise. Muscle reduces its energy use. Even the heart slows down. But the brain says, no matter what, I need about 110 grams of sugar or an alternative fuel. So the question that comes about is that, does the brain have an obligate requirement for sugar? The body can store about 100 to 300 grams of glycogen, which is the storage form of sugar in the liver. The muscle glycogen is not available for brain use, but the body can convert protein through gluconeogenesis to sugar. However, all the protein and all the glycogen is not enough to supply the brain with energy needs, even for a short duration of fast. So biology has designed ketones. These are water-soluble molecules that are derived from fat as replacement energy source for the brain when fasting or when being on a low-carb diet. So what are the brain's energy needs when it goes from the fed to fasted? It still needs an equivalent of about 110 to 140 grams of carbs. A person who is living his entire life on a standard American diet, it's a truly tragic situation, because all they can consume is sugar by the brain. On the other hand, when you fast for about 3 days, the brain can convert from using sugar to using ketones for 30% of its energy requirements. When you are a professional faster, as one would be if they belong to the fasting method or the intensive dietary management, and by the way, I'm a part of that, and it should have come in my disclosures. But if you're fasting for 5 to 7 days, the body is maximum at producing ketones, and the brain can use about 60% of its energy requirements from ketones, 30% come from sugar or glucose, and 10% we are not clear about. An important question I want to address is, can the brain use 100% ketones? And I put that in bold out there to answer that no, it cannot use 100% ketones. It's dangerous. There is an obligate requirement for some sugar. 100% ketones cannot be used. The brain will not function and perhaps can get damaged. This is an important factor that I want to emphasize to my type 1 diabetics who are doing fasting, who are following a low carb diet, because often their ketone levels are high, their sugar levels fall to dangerously low levels, and they ask me, is that safe? My answer to that should not be perhaps not. I should say, no, I do not think it is safe. The reason ketones are such an important fuel is because sugar, if that was the only fuel that brain needed, we will break down a lot of muscle. After 5 days of fasting, the switch of brain from sugar to ketones will reduce the muscle breakdown quite significantly, in the sense that very little muscle mass is lost, because most of the sugar that the brain needs, the 30% sugar that it needs, can be derived from glycerol, which is a part of the triglycerides. So in other words, it's coming from fat and it's not coming from muscle breakdown. So what are ketones and where are they made? The ketones are water-soluble molecules that are made from fat, either the fat that we eat, and hopefully when we are fasting, we mobilize the visceral fat, which is not good for us, and not mobilize so much the subcutaneous fat. The liver picks them up and makes them into these small molecules. The structure of them on the right, you don't need to really know the structure, but these are water-soluble small molecules that the brain can use for energy. Now, the liver is the only site in the body that can make ketones. The reason is that the liver contains a certain enzyme which is called HMG-CoA synthase. You don't need to know that. The only reason I have put out the slide with all the chemical names and the chemical information is for the nerds like me. But for the rest of us, all the slide is trying to convey to you is that the liver is perhaps the only organ in the body that can make ketones, because it contains the rate-limiting enzyme for ketone formation. Even though the liver can make ketones, it cannot burn ketones. The reason it cannot burn ketones is because it lacks a certain enzyme that is needed to burn ketones. And that enzyme, it's got a pretty long name, I'm not going to get into that, but that enzyme is present in significant amounts in the brain, in the muscles, in the heart. But you will see that there are reasons why the ketones are more or less reserved for the brain. Now, for ketones to be made, a few requirements have to be met. Number one is that the fat cells have to release fat. So the release of fat by the fat cells can only happen when your insulin levels are low. low insulin levels are going to happen when you're fasting or when you are on a low carb diet. Fasting is better. It can also happen with exercise, as we shall explore later. Now, the fat cells release fatty acids in the presence of low insulin, but the liver becomes receptive to making ketones, taking up the fatty acids and converting them to ketones only in the presence of high glucagon levels. And again, the rise in glucagon happens with fasting, with a low carb diet, and with exercise. So here is a diagram in which fatty acids, now I'll use the cursor out here, the fatty acids are taken up by the mitochondria through the mitochondrial membrane. And inside the mitochondria, the fatty acids are converted to acetyl-CoA. Now the liver can burn that acetyl-CoA for energy, but the energy requirements for liver are not very high. It wants to supply energy for the rest of the body. So it converts the acetyl-CoA in the absence of sugar metabolism. In other words, when you are burning fat, to ketone bodies, as the arrow points out. Now, to make this redundant, what is happening is that in the absence of sugar, the glucagon levels are going up. And high glucagon levels are going to prevent the burning of sugar. In other words, glycolysis, which is the initiation for sugar burning, is stopped by glucagon. When sugar is very high, the body is in the process of converting sugar to fat through malonyl-CoA. Glucagon prevents that. Glucagon also prevents the action of malonyl-CoA so that the fatty acids can be used by the mitochondria to be converted to ketones, like we have pointed out. So how much ketones do we make depending on a different fasting state? So in here is showing somebody who's done an overnight fast. The levels of ketones are quite low, about 0.1 millimole. Now, as you extend the fast to starvation, which is 5 to 7 days of no eating, the ketone levels go to a robust 6 to 7.5 millimoles, and they plateau. They don't go up any further, and we will figure out why they don't go up any further. In this situation, you're getting about roughly 30 grams of fuel from fat. In this situation, you're getting up to nearly 300 grams. So that's a tenfold increase in the availability of fuel for the body to use. Diabetic ketoacidosis is very different, in which ketone levels can go up to 15 millimoles or greater than 10 millimoles. The amount of ketones in grams is very high, and we'll explore that in a different part of the presentation. So the liver is making ketones. What organs use ketones, and how effectively and how much? Now, our body is designed in such a way that ketones are more or less reserved for the brain. Now, this is a very important aspect. In experiments that were done in the 1960s, George Cahill and Owens found out that about 15% of ketones are extracted from blood flowing into the brain. So in other words, whether the ketone levels are very low at 0.1 or ketone levels are very high at 7 millimoles, the brain can remove about 15% of the ketones present. So like, for example, I'll give you a ridiculous example. If the ketone levels is 100 grams in the blood flowing into the brain, it'll remove 15 grams. If it's 200 grams, it'll remove 30 grams. So in other words, the amount of ketones extracted by the brain is about 15%. Whereas as the ketone levels go up, the muscles can extract less and less of the ketones. So in other words, they have what is called saturation kinetics. At low ketone levels, they can extract more. At high ketone levels, they extract less. So in the experiments that Cahill and Owens did, they cannulated the blood vessel that's supplying the brain and cannulated the blood vessel that is draining the brain and measured the difference in ketone levels. This is called the arteriovenous difference. And through these studies, they found out that the brain can extract up to about 15% from the blood flowing into it, the amount of ketones, and it remained 15% regardless of whether the ketone levels were low or the ketone levels were high. On the other hand, in the muscles, and these are called saturation kinetics, when the ketone levels are low, the muscles are capable of extracting significant amount. But as the ketone levels are going up, the amount of extraction goes down to about 2 to 5%. So to make it redundant, ketone body uptake by the muscles is a saturable process. In other words, it goes down at high ketone levels. The gut behaves the same way. And the primary reason the body designed this is so that the ketones can be reserved for the brain. And the reason they are reserved for the brain is because it will protect our muscles. If the brain could not use ketones and needed sugar, we would be wasting a lot of lean muscle mass in order to feed the brain. And as I have said, the brain is uncompromising in its need for energy. So before I get nerdy, I want to reiterate this point. The brain extracts about 10 to 15% of ketones for blood, whether it's high ketone level or low ketone level. But at high ketone level, about 60% of brain's energy is coming from ketones. This point is so important that I'm stating it again. At high ketonemia of 5 millimoles, 60% of brain's energy is coming from ketones. Whereas the muscles and the gut demonstrate saturation kinetics. What that means is that at low ketone levels, they extract more of the ketones flowing into it, but as ketone levels go up, the percentage of extraction goes down. And when you put all of this into equation, and this will become important when we are talking about exogenous ketones, that ketones provide, whether you are high ketone levels or low ketone levels, they provide less than 7% of the total energy that the muscles use. So in terms of energy consumption, they are contributing about 7% of muscle energy, whether the ketone levels are high or low. So here is a nerdy part. And if you tune off, I would feel disappointed because I'm going to take everybody through these slides. So in other words, it's never going to be nerdy enough that almost everybody will understand this. So here are experiments done in humans at various stages of fasting, and they are done at an exercise level of 50% of your maximum oxygen use. So here is an 18-hour fasted individual. The ketone levels are low. They are exercised for 120 minutes at that amount of maximum oxygen consumption. Here is a 60-hour fasted individual. Their ketone levels are about 3.5. And here is a 5-day, 110-day fasted individual with ketone levels of about 5.5. So what happens with exercise? With overnight fast, with exercise, the ketone levels are going up. However, when you fasted for about 5 days, the ketone levels, instead of going up, they're coming down. Why is that the case? Now, this is an important point to explore. The reason that is the case is something called splanchnic blood flow and muscle blood flow. With exercise, you will increase your muscle blood flow and you will reduce the blood flowing into the liver. So the raw material that the liver needs to make ketones, which is free fatty acid, becomes less available, and hence when you are already at maximum ketone production after 5 days of fasting, your ketone levels are not going to go up further. One of the reasons is because the blood flow to the liver goes down and the amount of raw materials that are available goes down. So shown here, at 18-hour fast, the ketone levels go up in terms of rate of production. RA is rate of appearance or rate of production, because at this stage, the ketone levels are not maximal at rest. The amount of fatty acids released go up, the liver takes them up and converts them to ketones. But at rest, in a 110-hour fasted individual, when ketone levels are already high, there is no further augmentation of fatty acids going to the liver, as I will show you. And high ketone levels prevent their own overproduction, so the ketone levels actually go down in terms of ketone production. Now, what happens to the fatty acids? So here are fatty acids in 18-hour fasted individuals, they're going up. But you will say, Dr. Ali, they're also going up in 110-hour fasted individuals, and you just told us that less fatty acids are available, and that's true to the liver. But the muscles use fatty acids as fuel in fasted situations. The brain cannot use it. So the muscles are using fatty acids, and so the fatty acids levels go up. But if you notice, the increase in fatty acid levels here in 110-hour fasted individuals is less than that in the 60-hour fasted individual. The reason is that high ketone levels prevent the release of fatty acids by its action. In other words, ketone levels do not want to augment its own overproduction when their levels are high. So when you put them together, you see that in 18-hour fast, the ketone levels are going up, the fatty acid levels are going up. Whereas in a 5-day fast, the ketone levels are coming down, and there is not the similar augmentation in fatty acids because the ketones hold them in check. Now, what about insulin levels? So this slide is showing you insulin levels. With exercise, and this is an important point for people to know who are hyperinsulinemic, who are insulin resistant, exercise reduces your insulin levels. So exercise is reducing your insulin level here in overnight fasted people. It's reducing also in 60-hour fasted individuals, but it is not having the same impact. In fact, it's not reducing when you're fasted for 110 hours. The reason is that ketones are insulinotropic. That means they make the body release insulin at high levels in order to prevent their own overproduction, a factor that will become important. And hence the insulin-glucagon ratio does not change even with exercise in people who are fasting for 5 days and already have maximally stimulated their ketone levels. How do I put it all together? The way I put it together is by telling that ketones control their own overproduction by releasing insulin. That ketones are reserved for the brain. that ketones contribute less than 7% of total muscle energy use. That the primary reason biology has designed this into our system is because of the energy hog brain, which refuses to compromise in terms of its fuel demands, whether you're fasting or fed. The brain wants its fuels. And ketone bodies, the maximal production of that is one of the fundamental mechanisms through which we prevent a loss in our muscle mass. A point that Jason Fung has been saying for about 7 years, which is amazing to have an insight like that. Now the question I get asked is that, how long should I fast? Is prolonged fasting detrimental? And several people have commented that prolonged fasting is quite detrimental. And I'm trying to answer that question here, but remember, the answer really should be, it depends on who you are. Are you a normal, healthy individual, as I'm showing in these studies, or are you morbidly obese or obese and insulin resistant? Because if you're obese and insulin resistant, this does not apply to you. But let's say you're normal and you are overnight fasted 18 hours. Your ketone levels are not that high. The total ketone levels are about 0.2. Your sugar levels are about 90 milligrams. Your growth hormone levels are low. On the other hand, fasting for about a little less than 3 days, your ketone levels went to 3.2. Your sugar dropped to about 70 milligrams, pretty good. And your growth hormone levels went up. And perhaps if you are healthy and you're fasting for about 5 days, one could make an argument that this is not that healthy because your sugar levels are now dropping to about 50 milligrams per deciliter. I'm converting the European units to American units. And like we said, the brain has an obligate need for some sugar, so you don't want the sugar to drop too much. And your growth hormone levels are dropping. This situation perhaps does not apply to people that Jason Fung is treating, that Megan Ramos is treating, who are insulin resistant and severely obese. The next question to ask is that, can you augment the benefit of fasting with exercise while fasted? So the answer to that question is a resounding yes. But let me qualify that. So you have done an overnight fast, you begin 120 minutes of exercise, and the more intense an exercise that you do, this is being done at 60% of your maximum oxygen consumption capacity, the more ketones you generate during exercise and immediately after exercise, provided that you don't eat. So you can augment the benefit of fasting. Like, for example, I tell people do an 18-hour fast. I want them to get up in the morning and exercise, and then they will not be eating for 5 hours. During this time period, they'll be generating a lot of ketones, and there could be other benefits, as you will get to see later on. Your sugar levels also drop. This is in normal individuals. Now here is a sensitive subject I'm going to address, and I think that many people who are vendors for exogenous ketones will get rather disappointed at me, because I'm going to take a stance today based on science that exogenous ketones are not beneficial and perhaps even harmful. What data do I have for that? So here is a study that's done in humans, and they were overnight fasted and they were exercised for about 120 minutes. And during exercise, or just before exercise, they were given exogenous ketones to one group, and to another group they were given saline. So let's look at first what happened to the group that got saline. So to the group that got saline, the endogenous ketone production went up a little bit with exercise, But look what's happening out here. The fatty acids, the fat cells are releasing fat for muscle energy use. Emptying your fat cells is one of the most health promoting activities that you can do, like Ted Naiman says. And at the same time, with exercise, your insulin levels were going down. But when you were given exogenous ketones, the increase in fatty acid levels got obliterated, even though your insulin levels went down. So taking exogenous ketones would be harmful to you because you will fail to empty your fat cells. It could perhaps be even more dangerous if you have been fasting for 5 days, as shown in this study. So in other words, this is a group of people that fasted for 5 days. Their ketone levels were already high, and at the end of that, they were given additional ketones, exogenous ketones out here. And when exogenous ketones were given, endogenous ketones, the body shut down the production of its own ketones, and it shut down the release of fatty acids from the fat cells. So these are very detrimental aspects of exogenous ketones because they're going to prevent the emptying of the fat cell, a very health promoting activity that you can do, and it's going to shut down the production of endogenous ketones. So to summarize, exogenous ketones should not be promoted at this time. They should only be reserved for research because studies have shown that ketones contribute very little to total muscle energy use. In other words, at the most about 7% of muscle energy can come from ketones. That they reduce the breakdown of endogenous ketones. That they prevent the emptying of the fat cells, which is one of the most health promoting activities that is needed. And another important point is that the brain, in order to take up the exogenous ketones, needs a ketone transporter, which is called monocarboxylate transporter, MCT. And the brain has to upregulate the monocarboxylate transporter, and it doesn't do that immediately. It takes a few days of fasting before the monocarboxylate transporter goes up. So the ketones can not even be used by the brain. And ketones disrupt the acid-base balance. In other words, the body can handle ketones up to 5 to 7 millimoles by the compensatory mechanisms that it has to prevent fluctuation in acid-base balance that are extremely important for the body to function well. So I think that they should be reserved for research, and this research should be done by third parties and not by ketone manufacturers. Otherwise, we would be making the same mistakes that the pharmaceutical industry has made. Now, do ketone bodies prevent their own overproduction? And thus, ketone bodies themselves prevent ketoacidosis, a situation in which ketone levels are going up to 10 millimoles and patient is become acidotic. In other words, acid levels in the bloodstream are going up. And here is an example of a study that's done in 41 humans, and they fasted for various periods of time, some up to about 20 days. And you can see that ketone body production with fasting goes up, but it remains at a certain level in terms of millimoles per minute per body surface area, and it doesn't go up. It remains at a plateau. And that's why the ketone body concentration goes up to a certain level, about 7, and refuses to go up because ketone bodies prevent their own overproduction by increasing insulin and preventing the fat cells from releasing too much fatty acids. What then, you may ask, is diabetic ketoacidosis? So diabetic ketoacidosis happens only in a situation in which insulin is deficient or absent. So here is a human study in which insulin was withdrawn. These people have no insulin at all out here. and they are exercised. When there is no insulin, the body is sugar starved. Insulin is needed to drive the sugar into the cells so that the cells have energy, that the body has energy. So the sugar levels go up in order to compensate for that. Ketone levels also go up because the body is sugar deprived, and when the body gets sugar deprived, like fasting, it starts making ketones. So the ketone levels were high. So these are diabetic individuals, these are controls. As they exercised, the ketone body levels went up, the sugar levels went up, the free fatty acids level went up because the insulin was not present to restrain the amount of fatty acid released into the bloodstream. And at the end of exercise, instead of the ketone levels coming down, because fatty acid levels remained high, and since there were no insulin, the ketone levels skyrocketed and caused ketoacidosis. This situation cannot occur in controls because there is insulin present, and at the end of exercise, insulin levels go up, preventing an increase in ketone levels out of control and preventing an increase in fat release from the fat cells. An important point to explore is about the SGLT2 inhibitors, and I see several TV ads that talk about you getting some money by filing a class action lawsuit because these drugs apparently cause euglycemic ketoacidosis, or they cause ketoacidosis, which is a life-threatening condition. And I'm sorry that that slide got cut off. So what are SGLT2 inhibitors? So the SGLT2 inhibitors act at the level of the kidneys and make the kidneys dump sugar into the urine, about 150 grams of sugar. We'll explore why they do that in a little bit. When less sugar is available for the liver, this is a mitochondria inside the liver turns to fat for fuel. So it takes fatty acids from fat cells and it converts them in the mitochondria to these ketone bodies that we have talked about. Now, the enzymatic machinery that is present to make ketones is also the same enzymatic machinery to make cholesterol, which is another one of my presentations that you might be interested in looking at. But what is happening with SGLT2 inhibitors is that this is a kidney tubule. The kidney is filtering sugar into the kidney tubule, and out here is a transporter that reabsorbs the sugar back into the bloodstream. And in the presence of this SGLT2 inhibitor, this sugar is not reabsorbed because it's a poison of the kidney tubule's glucose transporter, and about 150 grams of sugar is dumped into the urine. So that is perhaps equivalent to about 40 teaspoons of sugar. So why does a person who is taking an SGLT2 inhibitor have euglycemic ketoacidosis, and who is at risk? The person who is at risk can be inferred by following the work of Dr. Joseph Kraft, and we have seen the slide many times. So these are Kraft 5 diabetics. What that means is that these are burnt out diabetics to whom the SGLT2 inhibitor is given. So who is that? So to a normal person who is fasting, and if you give 150 grams of sugar, the insulin levels go up in order to deal with that sugar, and they gradually come down over a 4-hour window. If you have severe insulin resistance and your pancreas is still capable of making insulin, your insulin levels can go severely high for the same sugar load. But over years and years, like 30 years, 40 years of diabetes, the pancreas dies. It cannot keep up by making more and more insulin, and you enter the stage of Kraft 5 diabetes, in which you are unable to mount an insulin response because your pancreas is dead. This is a person who's dumping sugar in the urine, and the liver is converting fat. They are insulinopenic, and so their sugar levels will not go up, but the ketone levels will go up, resulting in diabetic ketoacidosis. So we have a number of patients who come in who are on these SGLT2 inhibitors, and they ask us, can we do fasting? Can we follow a low carb diet? And our response to that is, yes, you can do that. Let us first check out how much insulin you're making. And in order for you to be safe, if you're on an SGLT2 inhibitor, we will not let you do fasting or low carb without you learning and monitoring your ketone levels on a regular basis. And we say if your ketone levels are going up to 5 millimoles, which really does not happen unless you're insulinopenic, that you should stop fasting. Now, we've already talked about how brain preferentially uses ketones, but is there something else that we need to know about ketones and the brain? And I think there is. The most important point I want to convey is the monocarboxylate transporter. So in other words, for the brain to pick up ketones, it needs a channel through which it can take it. And the brain is very special because it has a blood-brain barrier. This is a lining of the blood cell inside the brain. This lining is impermeable because the endothelial cells have tight junctions. They are close together, so they prevent the permeability of sugar and ketones. So ketones have to be actively transported through a channel, and at the level of the blood-brain barrier, it's the MCT1, the monocarboxylate transporter 1. At the level of the nerve cells, it's MCT2, and at the levels of the astrocytes, which are the supporting cells of the brain that make cholesterol and other raw materials, it's MCT4, as pointed out here. But an important question from some research studies is that when you are on a lifetime of standard American diet, or when you are exposed just to sugar as fuel for the brain, you may downregulate the monocarboxylate transporters in the brain, and they may take time to upregulate. How much time they take, we do not know. Now we know that liver is the only site for production of ketones, as we have talked about. Does the liver downregulate the amount of ketones it can make in somebody who's eating 3 standard American meals plus 2 to 3 snacks? Perhaps not. Perhaps we know that information that everybody who's abused standard American diet for years and years can still make ketones. It's a comforting thought to have. At least the liver is capable of making ketones. But we don't know this information. Does the brain preserve its enzymatic machinery to make ketones? We don't know this answer. So in other words, even though the liver may make ketones, and even though the monocarboxylate transporter, that is the channel through which the brain takes ketones, can get upregulated, does the brain lose its ability to make ketones after years and years of non-use? These are answers that we should get. An important aspect in a presentation is to be redundant. And so here I am being redundant, which is talking about the prerequisites for ketone body use by the brain. The number one thing is that you got to create a situation. You got to be either fasting or use a low carb diet or exercise to reduce your insulin levels, reduce your insulin glucagon ratio so that the liver can make ketones. That the MCT, the transporter that the brain needs, should be induced and upregulated. That you should be constantly using the enzymatic machinery. We don't know whether that gets downregulated for brain ketone use. Are ketones raw materials for cholesterol and fatty acids and amino acids in the brain? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. The brain can convert ketones to cholesterol and fatty acids much better than it can convert sugar. It requires fewer steps, 5 as opposed to 7. It can use the ketones right from the cytosol without it having to enter the mitochondria. And this is an important aspect of brain development in the neonate. It has been demonstrated in humans. It has been demonstrated in rats. There are certain humans who lack the enzymatic machinery to use ketones. They're born with an inborn error in which the brain cannot use ketones. And in these people, when MRI scans were done, it was found that they had lesions that were formed because important components of the brain that the brain uses in a neonate to make brain components is not available. They had white matter deficits. So ketones are better raw materials for the brain to make cholesterol and fatty acids. Do ketones help with sleep? So here is a study which was done before the person started a ketogenic diet. There is lack of stage 4 sleep, deep sleep, which is considered to be important. There's lack of REM sleep. And there are very many studies that have duplicated this, that ketones increase both REM sleep after a ketogenic diet and increase deep sleep. At Low Carb Houston last year, we did a 3-day fast in 10 individuals, and the first 2 days they found it difficult to sleep, but the third day they reported that their sleep was better. Do ketones improve cognitive performance? In children who are at higher risks for seizures, who were given ketones for treatment of their seizures, or who were put on a ketogenic diet rather than given ketones, a misstatement I said. In other words, they were on a ketogenic diet, their ketone levels were up. These are the number of studies. And it's showing that uniformly that the ketones improve cognitive performance in terms of attention, in terms of alertness, in terms of global cognition. So perhaps ketones are better fuel. What are the mechanisms through which ketones prevent seizures? And going by how important this is, I would have expected to know that. But there is no real incentive for any drug manufacturer to research this. So at this time, these are mostly hypotheses, and that is that ketone bodies are very similar to a neurotransmitter that reduces seizures like GABA. So that's why they reduce seizures, that ketone bodies are better raw materials for the brain to make cholesterol and fatty acids. That ketone bodies reserve energy for brain because they are an alternative fuel, and that ketone bodies also make certain amino acids that increase neurotransmitters that reduce seizures, such as GABA. And finally, if you've ever looked at the electron transport chain, that is the place in the mitochondria in which you're burning fuel to make energy, the ketones are cleaner burning fuel. They create less oxidative damage. We've already gone through this a little bit, that ketones help make better neurotransmitters. In other words, the GABA level, which is a neurotransmitter that reduces seizures, that has a calming effect, goes up because ketones shift the balance towards glutamate, which is a precursor for GABA, and hence enhance perhaps the seizure control. So how would I summarize this? Very complex, sort of nerdy presentation. I'm known to give nerdy presentations for the layman. The way I would do this is that the benefits of ketogenesis and ketonemia for the brain are many. Number one, that it provides an alternative fuel to the brain. So when you have an alternative fuel, you may perhaps improve insulin sensitivity, because the very fact that you're making ketones means that you have to drop your insulin levels, and when you drop your insulin levels, you can rehabilitate the insulin receptor in the brain. You reduce sugar toxicity to the brain. Perhaps if you give sugar all the time, you will downregulate the channel through which the brain uses sugar, which is the GLUT1 receptor or the GLUT1 pore. Using ketones perhaps gives a chance for the GLUT1 channel to recover. We've already said that ketones are a better method or raw material for structural components of the brain, the cholesterol, the fat, the protein, the better neurotransmitters, that it's a cleaner burning fuel. The presence and degree of ketonemia implies that you are emptying your fat cells. And like Ted Naiman said, emptying your fat cells and cycling the fat cells from empty to full is one of the most health promoting aspects you can adopt. And you can only do that effectively with fasting and low carb diet and exercise or a combination thereof, as I have shown before. When your ketone levels are high, in essence, you're practicing autophagy, you're practicing self-cleaning, because when you're making ketones, you're also doing gluconeogenesis. You're making sugar from protein, so you're removing dead and senescent protein. That's an important aspect. You're going to prevent your pancreas from hypertrophying and dying earlier than your lifespan. So I'd like to conclude that a lifetime of a standard American diet is truly sad. And I mean it in that way, since it will prevent the liver's ability to make ketones. What I meant was that pun was intended, the standard American diet being truly sad, because the liver cannot make ketones, that the brain perhaps cannot induce the ketone transporters, the MCTs, that it might become more difficult if you are on a standard American diet for years and decades for the brain to induce the production of MCTs, and perhaps the brain will downregulate the enzymes that are needed to metabolize ketones, and it might make achieving health a lot more difficult. Thank you, and I'll see you at KetoCon online question and answer session.